There was a very slight bump, just a little jar, nothing at all. And one man said, "Look at that. That's an iceberg."
The story of the Titanic really began several years before her keel was even laid. The Titanic was the product of a process of evolution that was occurring in shipbuilding for the North Atlantic run. Ships were getting bigger, faster, more luxurious all the time.
I'd never seen a big ship before. And really, as you looked along the side of it, you simply couldn't see the end of it. It was so long. And I was quite fascinated by that. And then we went aboard. And there was I, gazing with wonder at this marvelous ship. And my father so excited. And we went up in the lift onto the boat deck, and my mother said to my father, "Well, now I know why I'm so frightened. Because that is the ship they are claiming is unsinkable." And my father put his arm around her and said, "No, my dear, that's the ship that is unsinkable."
The Titanic was enough of a story, even before the disaster happened, to kind of create this, this myth that it was an unsinkable ship.
In a lot of ways, it was like a Greek tragedy, just a series of events, a chain of events, one leading to the other. You had the arrogance of Edwardian society, believing that they could build an unsinkable ship, and consequently not taking adequate precautions in the face of known hazards and known danger. You had a whole array of details that went wrong for that ship. From the time she left Southampton Harbor, even before that, even when she was building, decisions made about her design, about her equipment, about the course that she would take, about how she was being navigated, the weather conditions, the ice conditions, which were freak conditions for 1912. The ice was much farther south than it had ever been before. All of these details contributed to that convergence of the twain, as Thomas Hardy called it, of ice and steel.
To me, what's most interesting isn't that it's a story that transcends time, but that it's a story that's been told and retold in time, that we keep making it meaningful to us. It was made meaningful to people in 1912, and we've again made it meaningful to us in different terms now. And that suggests that the disaster isn't timeless, isn't the stuff of Greek tragedy, but is timely, is the stuff of history.
The larger the ship is, the cheaper passengers can be taken across the Atlantic. There was such a demand for third-class passengers, immigrants, to travel from the old world to the new world, to America. Steamship companies were just overwhelmed. They just couldn't keep pace with it. And it's not the first-class and the second-class passengers that were really the primary reason why these big ships were built. It was the third class, it was the immigrants. And of course, once they were in America and they got employment, they were able then to act as almost as a bridgehead to bring other members of the family across. The steamship companies were well aware of this. So they treated third-class passengers extremely well, even though they were only one-way passengers. Remember, there's no return fare here. Important to treat them very, very well. That's why they had up to 4 meals a day. That's why they had stewards serving them at table. That's why they didn't have to bring their own bed linen or china and knives and forks. It was all laid on for them. And each passenger would be given a little menu card. And on the back of that menu card was a postcard. They would be invited to send back that little postcard, one side a postcard, one side a menu, back to their relatives living in Russia or Scandinavia or wherever. And they could prove that they'd had a good time traveling from Europe to America by the White Star Line.
The third-class passengers within the social structure of 1912 very often were exactly that, third class. They were predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly, members of the working class. And they and their forebears had spent generation after generation being told what to do, when to do it, where to go, by the people who the society had placed over them. It cost many of them their lives. There were locked barriers between the third-class areas of the ship and the rest of the vessel. Those barriers were not put up by the White Star Line to keep the third-class passengers out and away from the lifeboats. Those barriers were required by American immigration laws.
Unfortunately, we don't know very much about the behaviour of the crew towards the third-class passengers on board the Titanic because principally there were very few survivors that worked in that class. But what we do know is that a great many of the third-class passengers were kept below decks.
In all of the confusion that existed among the Titanic's officers and crew the night that she went down, no one made certain that those gates and barricades were unlocked and opened, allow the third-class passengers access to the boats and the upper decks. Some of them were open, some of them weren't, but nobody made sure that all of them were. There was no policy of discrimination against third class. What happened was they were forgotten about.
The safety of navigation at sea in those days was the responsibility primarily of the Board of Trade, and this is a British government organisation which is set up to police merchant ships at that period. And they would have varying regulations, number of life jackets on board, number of lifeboats. But ships had become so large so quickly that they outpaced the regulations. Most regulations said that you had to have about 16 lifeboats on a vessel up to 10,000 tons. Well, of course, Titanic weighed 45,000 tons, carrying far more passengers than a 10,000-ton vessel. Yet she had lifeboat provision for a 10,000-ton ship.
Lifeboats are of a standard size. They carry 65 people. And the regulation that was in effect in 1912 had been formulated in 1895. The decision to only carry the minimum number of lifeboats required by law was actually made by Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. It was made in the light of not only the belief that the ship was unsinkable and the lifeboats would not be needed, but also to maximize the deck space for the convenience of the passengers. It was a businessman's decision.
Captain Smith was a very typical Edwardian male skipper. He had reached the very zenith of his career in 1912. The practices, the skills that he had been developed from the days of sail.
Captain Edward J. Smith was the most experienced mariner in service in the White Star Line and probably the most respected captain on the North Atlantic run. He never had a serious accident. He was at the pinnacle of his career. In fact, he had planned on retiring after he brought the Titanic back from New York. He was going to literally go out in a blaze of glory. It would be safe to say that what Captain Smith did in terms of navigating the ship, what his procedures were for posting lookouts, handling the ice warnings and such, he was doing nothing different than any other skipper on the North Atlantic would have done in similar circumstances. It was an SOP, standard operating procedure, to get an ice warning, to post extra lookouts, but maintain your speed. Within the living memory of most of the people on board that vessel, no one had ever known of a ship striking an iceberg and sinking. After the collision, Captain Smith's behavior, his decision-making process, for a time, very decisive. And he reacts, he gives orders, he directs the actions of his officers and crew, and then all of a sudden something happens to him. And his decisions become vague. He gives incomplete orders. He doesn't make sure the orders are followed up. He doesn't bother to walk down the boat deck to see if the boats are being filled to capacity.
I think when Captain Smith realised that the Titanic would founder, I think he was so shocked by that news, like many other passengers and certainly many of the other officers, couldn't really come to terms with the fact that this ship would sink. And I think from that moment on, I think the effective command structure of the Titanic just basically broke to pieces.
Right around midnight, he had a conference with Thomas Andrews, who was the man who had built the Titanic. And Andrews explained very carefully and very clearly that the Titanic was going to sink. It was not a question of if, it was only a question of when. Smith suddenly realized that 1,000 people under his care, who were in his responsibility, in his charge, were going to die.
A man came to my door. He said, "Madam, get up, get out. Do you know they're making the women and children leave in lifeboats? They say you're coming back for breakfast. You know, these crazy English, they do anything. They make you get up and go off in boats and go off and come back for breakfast. What do you think of that?" And I had a wool cap and 2 fox furs and a paper-thin broadtail coat and no underwear and no stockings, but a pair of velvet slippers and these buckles, and I lost a buckle. And who should I see? Mr. Mock, a miniature painter. And he said, "Look, there's trouble." I just said, "No." Well, he said, "You'll have to jump now into the lifeboat." I said, "Jump? With this thing I've got on? What do you think I am, an acrobat or a monkey or something? I can't jump in this thing." Well, he said, "You'll have to."
Arthur Lewis, a bedroom steward, was saved because he was detailed to row one of the lifeboats.
What were the other passengers like in the lifeboat?
Well, they never spoke, you see. There's women and children in the boat all night, but they never spoke. They just sat back down there waiting to get picked up.
But you never talked to each other?
No, well, we didn't know one another, so we couldn't get in conversation.
If you were a man who survived the Titanic disaster, you had a lot to answer for. You really did. So that J. Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman of the White Star Line, was a universal villain in the American press, not only because he was a man who got into a lifeboat while some women and children didn't, but also because of his position as the owner of the ship, in effect. And the owner of the ship should go down with it, and so he's doubly a coward. But it really was a stigma if you were a man to have survived. And so either you had to explain that you had jumped at the last minute and through an extraordinary feat of athleticism, you'd made your way to a lifeboat and gotten hauled in, or you had to explain that you had been chosen to row a lifeboat. You'd been asked by the crew to get in. But if you just found yourself in a lifeboat, you had a lot to answer for.
The Edwardians had a belief that it was better to die than to be perceived a coward. And what were these men dying for? And a lot of them knew they were going to die. The 34 engineers kept the power going. The Titanic had lights and electricity for the wireless until just about 2 minutes before she actually sank. Those engineers never had a chance. Chief Engineer Bell released them about 2 o'clock, said, "Go make your way to the top decks. Save yourselves." They stayed down in the ship, making sure the electricity stayed going until the very end. They knew they weren't going to get away. All right, why? What was worth dying for? Why was it so important? They were dying because they wanted other people to live. The Californian was 11 miles away from the Titanic when the Titanic sank. The Californian's officers stood on her bridge watching the Titanic firing distress rockets. 3 separate times they told Captain Lord there was a ship nearby firing white rockets. Lord did nothing. He didn't order the Californian to steam over to the ship that was firing the rockets. He didn't even order the wireless operator awoken. The Carpathia, Rostron's ship, was almost 60 miles from the Titanic. When Harold Cottam, who was the wireless operator on the Carpathia, got the Titanic's distress signal, he ran out onto the bridge, ran up to the Carpathia's first officer, Dean, and said, "Sir, the Titanic is sinking, she needs our help." Then Cottam turned around, ran down to the captain's cabin, didn't even knock, just threw open the door, ran in and said, "Sir, the Titanic is sinking. She requests our assistance immediately." Now, Rostron swung his legs out of his bunk, looked at First Officer Dean and said, "Mr. Dean, turn the ship around. Now, Cottam, are you sure it's the Titanic, and are you sure she needs our help?" Arthur Rostron wasn't willing to waste the seconds necessary to confirm Cottam's report before he acted. He had the ship turning around even before he got confirmation. He thundered north as fast as he could go, dodging icebergs, dodging growlers, because there was someone out there who needed his help. And nothing was going to get in his way.
Titanic lays facing slightly to the northeast. It's in 2 sections, bow and stern. Got about 600 meters in between. Debris field.
There are 2 schools of thought on taking artifacts from the debris field or the area of the Titanic. It is really not a science battle. It is not an archaeological battle. It is more of an emotional battle. Some people feel that it is a grave site and shouldn't be touched. Of the 7 expeditions that have been there, no one has ever found what we call a trace element, a trace of a human body being on the bottom of the ocean.
The people who are opposed to salvage take the view that this is a grave site and that it's sacrilege to tamper with it, and feel that it's, you know, the most crass kind of exploitation to bring this stuff to the surface and to put it on display.
Oh, bro, you see some disturbed sediments. You see.
Okay,
it's rising,
all right,
rising.
there's some of the metal. Oh, come left, Anatoly, come left. We got an engine. I think we got an engine telegraph.
Okay, bring it up just a tiny bit.
Trimming half.
Just a bit, good. I turn a little bit left. Is it okay?
I like it really much.
Okay.
I'm gonna activate the arm.
I stopped the vehicle.
I'll show you what condition this is in after 79 years. Look at how well it holds together. Watch this. Look at it. That bag is just in almost as perfect shape as the day it was put on the ship.
I think our contract doesn't allow us to do this.
Okay, what about if the ship's log or the Rubaiyat's in there?
It'd be wonderful, but...
Okay.
Rolf, we have scientific mission.
This will only take 10 minutes. Let's just see what...
We shouldn't take anything, you know.
Let's don't take anything, but let's see if the ship's log or the Rubaiyat may be in the bag.
I don't like any scandal, you know. I'm sorry about it.
No scandals.
I'm responsible for that.
If it stays on the bottom, it's not a scandal. But if it is the ship's log, a lot of questions could be answered.
Yeah, but if we try to take it right now with it, we'll just ruin the bag, and we might rip the Rubaiyat. Mark it. We'll come back later, Ralph. I mean, save it for later.
You just can touch, but not take. That's it.
Okay, let's just take a look out there and see if that's one of the back bags to begin with.
Just touch if you wish.
going to kind of feel it a little bit.
All right, now let me see if I can get the top to pry open and see what's inside this bag.
No, Rolf, I don't think so. You should open this bag because it's not yours, you know. It belongs to some other people.
It's right here. It's in the arm.
Put it down gently. Put it down gently.
Put it down.
Give me it.
Put it on the bottom.
Okay.